You know those moments that completely change your life. For me, it wasn't landing my first $1 million contract or launching my tech company. It was the day I decided to work as a barista at a local coffee shop in downtown Seattle. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. I know what you're thinking. Why would a successful entrepreneur spend her mornings making lattes? The truth is, after years of people only seeing my bank account instead of me, I needed something real. Something that would let me connect with people who didn't know about the zeros in my net worth. That's how I met James. He walked in one rainy Tuesday morning, laptop tucked under his arm, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was slightly crooked, and his hair was doing this adorable thing where it stuck up in the back. As I took his order, a simple Americano, extra shot, he actually looked me in the eyes and smiled. Not the fake smile people give service workers, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. Rough morning? I asked, already starting his drink. More like a rough quarter, he laughed, running a hand through his already messy hair. I'm an environmental lawyer, and we're fighting this big corporation that's been dumping waste into local waterways. The kind of case that makes you question humanity's basic decency. I felt my heart skip a beat. Here was someone who could have been on the other side of the table, making millions defending those corporations. But instead, he chose to fight for what's right. As I handed him his coffee, our fingers brushed, and I swear I felt that cliché spark everyone talks about. He became a regular after that. Every morning, same time, same order. We'd talk about everything and nothing. His cases, my dreams of starting my own business someday, if he only knew, his favorite books, my love for old sci-fi movies. He never once treated me like I was beneath him because I was serving him coffee. One day, he came in looking particularly victorious. We won the case, he announced, beaming. The company has to pay for full cleanup and compensate the affected communities. That calls for celebration, I said, already reaching for a cup. This one's on the house. Actually, he hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. I was wondering if you'd let me take you to dinner instead. My heart soared and sank at the same time. I'd been waiting for this moment, but it also meant potentially complicating the beautiful simplicity of what we had. Still, looking at his hopeful expression, I knew I couldn't say no. I didn't want to. I'd love that, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. That evening, we went to this tiny Italian restaurant tucked away in a neighborhood I'd actually helped develop. Though he didn't know that. He pulled out my chair, asked questions about my life, and listened, really listened, to my answers. I told him about growing up in a small town, about my dreams of making a difference in the world. I kept the details vague but true. Everything I told him about who I was as a person was real. I just omitted the part about my company revolutionizing sustainable energy storage solutions. As we shared tiramisu for dessert, I watched him talk passionately about his latest environmental initiative, and I knew I was in trouble. This wasn't just attraction or intrigue anymore. This was the beginning of something real, something that could last. But with real relationships come real complications. I knew I'd have to tell him the truth eventually, but for now, I wanted to hold on to this. These precious moments where someone saw me for me, not my net worth or my company's stock price. Little did I know, meeting his mother would make my little coffee shop charade look like a walk in the park. But that's getting ahead of the story. That night, walking home from the restaurant, James took my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could just be Sarah, not Sarah Chen, tech mogul and Forbes 30 under 30 recipient, but just Sarah, the barista who loved sci-fi movies and could make a mean cappuccino. As he kissed me goodnight on my doorstep of my modest apartment, not my penthouse across town, I realized something that would prove both wonderful and terrifying. I was falling in love with someone who had no idea who I really was. And somehow, that made it more real than anything I'd experienced before. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if I should have told him everything right then. But you know what they say about hindsight. Besides, the way everything unfolded, well, let's just say karma has a way of making things work out exactly as they should. Living a double life isn't easy, but there's something liberating about waking up in my modest two-bedroom apartment instead of my luxury penthouse. The furniture is from IKEA, the coffee maker is a basic model, and the view is of a brick wall instead of the Puget Sound. But it's real, and it's where I bring James when we spend time together. People often ask me why I chose to hide my wealth, especially from someone I was falling for. The truth is, I learned the hard way that money changes everything. After my company's IPO 3 years ago, suddenly everyone wanted to be my best friend. Ex-boyfriends crawled out of the woodwork, distant relatives remembered my existence, and every dinner conversation turned into a subtle pitch for investment opportunities. But let me take you back to where it all started. 10 years ago, I was working 3 jobs to put myself through engineering school. My days started at 4 a.m. at a diner, then classes, then nights at a tech repair shop. That's where I first got the idea for my energy storage solution. I noticed how many devices we threw away because of battery degradation, and I thought there had to be a better way. I spent 2 years developing my prototype in a garage I rented for $200 a month. My diet consisted mainly of ramen noodles and coffee. When I finally got my first investor meeting, I couldn't even afford a proper business suit. I bought one from a thrift store and altered it myself. They turned me down, by the way. Said a girl from nowhere couldn't possibly understand the complexities of energy storage technology. That rejection fueled me. I refined my prototype, entered every competition I could find, and finally won a major tech innovation grant. That's when things started to change. My technology worked, and it worked better than anyone expected. Within 3 years, we were partnering with major manufacturers. 2 years after that, we went public. But success came with a price. Every relationship felt conditional. Every compliment seemed to hide an agenda. That's why I started my barista experiment. I needed to remember who I was before the money to make sure I hadn't lost touch with reality. James doesn't see me as a CEO or a billionaire. He sees me as the girl who makes his coffee and geeks out over Star Trek. Last week, he cooked dinner for me in my small kitchen. The pasta was slightly overcooked, and we had to eat on my secondhand couch because I don't have a proper dining table. It was perfect. He told me about his childhood dreams of becoming a superhero lawyer, fighting for justice. I shared stories about my parents, the real stories, about my mom working double shifts as a nurse, and my dad driving trucks cross-country. I just left out the part about how I bought them a beachfront house in Hawaii last year. Sometimes I feel guilty about the deception. Like yesterday, when James was stressing about his student loans, I wanted so badly to tell him I could wipe out his debt with what I spend on office supplies in a month. But I've learned that money, while it solves some problems, creates others. The irony isn't lost on me. Here I am, worth billions on paper, shopping at discount stores and clipping coupons to maintain my cover. My assistant thinks I'm crazy. Just tell him, she says. If he's really the one, he'll understand. Maybe she's right, but I've worked too hard to build this genuine connection to risk it now. Besides, there's something empowering about being liked for who you are, not what you own. When James looks at me with those kind eyes, he's seeing Sarah the barista, who makes him laugh and remembers exactly how he likes his coffee. He's falling for the girl who supposedly lives paycheck to paycheck, but still volunteers at the animal shelter every weekend. The girl who dreams of starting her own business someday, not knowing she already runs a Fortune 500 company. Living simply has taught me more about true value than any business deal ever could. It's shown me that the best things in life, like the way James absent-mindedly plays with my hair while we watch movies, or how he leaves silly notes in my tip jar, really are free. But I'm not naive. I know this can't last forever. Sooner or later, my two worlds will collide, and when they do, everything will change. I just hope that when the truth comes out, James will understand why I chose to live this way, why I needed to know that someone could love me for me, not my net worth. For now, though, I'll keep living my double life. I'll keep making lattes in the morning and attending board meetings in the afternoon. I'll keep my designer clothes hidden in my other apartment while wearing thrifted sweaters on dates. Because sometimes, the simple life is the richest life of all. They say you can tell a lot about a person by the way they treat service workers. Well, the day I met James's mother, Margaret Winchester, she taught me exactly what kind of person she was in less than 5 minutes. It was a busy Thursday morning at the coffee shop. I was in the middle of my usual shift, hair pulled back in a messy bun, traces of flour on my apron from the morning's pastry delivery. The bell above the door chimed, and in walked a woman who looked like she'd just stepped out of a country club catalog. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, Hermes scarf, and the kind of jewelry that screams old money. I didn't know who she was at first. She stood at the counter, examining our menu board through designer glasses as if it were written in hieroglyphics. "Do you serve anything that isn't—" She paused, wrinkling her nose. "Covered in caramel and whipped cream?" "We have a full range of traditional coffee drinks," I replied with my best customer service smile. "Our house blend just won a local roasting award." She made a dismissive sound. "I suppose a plain cappuccino will have to do. Whole milk, not that awful soy stuff." She glanced at my name tag. "Sarah, is it? You're the one dating my son, James." My heart stopped for a moment. This was Margaret Winchester, the mother James had mentioned with a mix of resignation and concern. The woman who'd sent her son to private schools in Switzerland and expected him to marry a debutante from their country club. "Yes, I'm Sarah. It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Winchester." I extended my hand across the counter, but she ignored it, instead scanning the shop with barely concealed disdain. James mentioned you worked here, but I assumed it was part-time while you finished your degree or something equally sensible." She drummed her manicured nails on the counter. "He did say you were charming." The way she said charming made it sound like a terminal illness. I focused on making her cappuccino, grateful for the mechanical task that kept my hands busy and my face turned away from her scrutiny. "You know," she continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "James has such potential. Partner track at his firm, connections with all the right families. His father and I always imagined he'd meet someone more suitable at one of our charity galas." I placed her cappuccino on the counter, the foam perfectly shaped into a delicate leaf. "That will be $4.75, Mrs. Winchester." She slid a $50 bill across the counter. "Keep the change, dear. I'm sure you need it more than I do." Her smile was as artificial as her pearls. Though I must say, it concerns me that my son is involving himself with someone of such limited means. No offense, of course. "None taken," I replied, maintaining my composure even as I imagined how satisfying it would be to reveal that I could buy her entire wardrobe with what I earn in interest each day. "James and I connect on things that matter more than money." Her eyes narrowed. "How quaint. But dear, let me give you some motherly advice. Men like James, men from our world, they might enjoy slumming it for a while, but eventually, they return to where they belong." A customer behind her cleared their throat impatiently, but Margaret wasn't finished. "I'm having a little dinner party next week. Some very influential people will be there, including several lovely young ladies from families we've known for years. I think it would be best if James attended alone. You understand, don't you?" I thought about James, about his passion for environmental law, his disdain for the corporate world his mother inhabited. Actually, Mrs. Winchester, James already invited me to that dinner. He's picking me up at 7. Her perfectly Botoxed forehead attempted to wrinkle. Did he now? Well, I suppose you could come. Do try to wear something appropriate. If you need to borrow something suitable, I'm sure my housekeeper has a dress she could lend you. The customer behind her actually gasped. I maintained my professional smile, even as I felt my cheeks burn. Thank you for the offer, Mrs. Winchester, but I think I can manage to dress myself. She took a sip of her cappuccino and grimaced as if it had personally offended her. Well, this has been illuminating. Do think about what I said, Sarah. It would be terrible to see James throw away his future on a barista. As she turned to leave, she accidentally knocked her cappuccino over. Hot coffee spread across the counter and dripped onto my shoes. Oh dear, how clumsy of me. But I'm sure you're used to cleaning up messes, aren't you? She swept out of the shop, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the bitter taste of classism. As I cleaned up the spilled coffee, I couldn't help but smile, imagining her face when she eventually discovered who I really was. Little did Margaret Winchester know, she'd just declared war on a woman who had built a billion-dollar company from nothing. A woman who had faced down boardrooms full of condescending men in expensive suits. A woman who knew exactly how to play the long game. The dinner party was going to be interesting, to say the least. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. I thought I had everything planned out. The perfect moment to tell James about my real identity. A way to ease him into my world gradually. But fate, as usual, had other plans. It happened on a random Tuesday evening. James had been acting strange all day, coming into the coffee shop multiple times, ordering different drinks he barely touched, fidgeting with something in his pocket. I assumed he was stressed about a big case. He came back just before closing time, as I was wiping down the counters and counting the day's tips. The autumn rain was drumming against the windows, and the streetlights cast a warm glow through the foggy glass. It felt like any other evening, until it wasn't. Sarah, he said, his voice unusually serious. Can we talk? My heart dropped. In my experience, can we talk usually preceded bad news. Had he discovered my secret? Had his mother finally convinced him I wasn't suitable? But then he smiled, that crooked, nervous smile that had first made me fall for him, and got down on one knee right there on the coffee-stained floor of my shop. I've been carrying this around for weeks, he said, pulling out a small velvet box. It's not much. I had to save for months. And it's probably not what you deserve, but... Inside was a simple, solitaire diamond ring. It wasn't the smallest diamond I'd ever seen, but it was far from the largest. I had paperweights worth more. But looking at it, knowing he'd saved his modest lawyer's salary to buy it, made it more valuable than any piece of jewelry I owned. I love you, he continued, his voice shaking slightly. I love how you put extra chocolate in my mocha when I'm having a rough day. I love how you volunteer at the animal shelter, even though you say you can barely make rent. I love how you dream big but never lose sight of what matters. Will you marry me? Tears welled up in my eyes, partly from joy, partly from guilt about my deception. But in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I loved this man, regardless of what happened when the truth came out. Yes, I whispered, then louder. Yes. He slipped the ring on my finger, and we kissed as the last customers in the shop applauded. It was perfect, until his mother found out. Margaret's reaction came swiftly and brutally. She swept into the coffee shop the very next morning, a storm in designer clothing. James told me the news, she announced, not even bothering to order anything. I assume you realize this is completely unacceptable. Good morning to you too, Mrs. Winchester, I replied calmly, continuing to serve customers. Don't be cute, she snapped. What's your angle? What do you want? Money, status, access to our family's connections? I had to bite back a laugh. If she only knew. I want to marry your son because I love him. Love, she scoffed. Love doesn't pay country club memberships or maintain a certain standard of living. James has responsibilities, expectations, which he's never cared about. I interrupted, finally meeting her gaze. Have you ever asked him what he wants? I know what's best for my son, she insisted. And this? She gestured dismissively at the coffee shop. At me. This is just a phase. A rebellion against his upbringing. He'll come to his senses. Then she played her trump card. We'll need a prenuptial agreement, of course. Something to protect James's interests. I smiled. Probably the first genuine smile I'd ever given her. I completely agree. In fact, I insist on it. That threw her. She'd clearly expected me to protest, to reveal some gold-digging motivation. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. I'll have our family lawyer draw up something appropriate, she said. Something to ensure you can't get your hands on the Winchester fortune. Actually, I replied, I'd prefer to use my own lawyers. To ensure everything's fair, of course. Something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even the first hint of worry. Good. That evening, when James called to apologize for his mother's behavior, I could hear the stress in his voice. I'm so sorry about the prenup thing, he said. You don't have to agree to it. We can elope or… James, I interrupted gently. I want to sign a prenup. Trust me. But it's insulting! You're the most genuine, least materialistic person I know. You work so hard, you give so much to others, and my mother treats you like some kind of con artist. If he only knew how right and wrong he was at the same time. Yes, I was genuine in my love for him, but I was also hiding a massive part of my life. The guilt gnawed at me. The prenup meeting is next week, I told him. Just try to keep an open mind, okay? About what? About everything. As I hung up, I looked at my engagement ring, then at my phone where notifications from my company's stock performance were flashing. The time for hiding was almost over. Soon, Margaret Winchester would learn just how wrong she'd been about the poor barista her son had fallen in love with. I just hoped James would understand why I'd kept up the charade for so long. The Winchester family estate sits on 3 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. As James drove us through the wrought iron gates, I couldn't help but smile. My company owned the tech startup that had developed their state-of-the-art security system. You okay? James squeezed my hand. We don't have to do this. I'm fine, I assured him, though my stomach was doing backflips. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A simple black dress from a mid-range department store, nice enough to not embarrass James, but not so nice that it would raise questions about how a barista could afford it. Margaret was waiting in the foyer, dressed as if she were hosting a state dinner rather than a family meal. James, darling, she air-kissed his cheeks before turning to me with considerably less enthusiasm. Sarah, that's an interesting choice of dress. Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Winchester, I replied pleasantly. Your home is beautiful. Yes, well, we believe in maintaining certain standards. She gestured to a uniformed maid. Martha, please show Sarah where she can freshen up. The freshening up suggestion was clearly a polite way of saying I needed improvement, but I followed Martha anyway. In the powder room, I heard voices drift in from the hallway. Mother, please behave tonight, James was saying. I'm simply trying to protect you, darling. Have you even asked about her family? Her background? For all we know, she could be after your trust fund. I checked my lipstick in the mirror, fighting back a laugh. If she only knew that I'd donated more to charity last year than the entire Winchester Trust Fund was worth. The dining room was a study in old money ostentation. Crystal chandelier, ancestral portraits, silver place settings that probably hadn't seen the inside of a dishwasher in generations. Margaret had seated me between James's ancient Aunt Cordelia, who was mostly deaf, and his cousin Bradley, a hedge fund manager who'd been trying to get a meeting with my company's investment team for months. "So, Sarah," Margaret began as the first course was served, "tell us about your education." "I went to public school," I said truthfully, watching her wince. "But I've always believed in continuous learning." "How progressive," she muttered. "And your family? What do they do?" "My mother's a nurse, and my father drives trucks." Also true, though they were both happily retired now, living in the beachfront house I'd bought them. "Blue collar through and through," Margaret commented to her wine glass. "James, darling, didn't that lovely Charlotte Astor just finish her MBA at Wharton? Her family's summer home is right next to ours in the Hamptons." James set down his fork with a clang. "Mother, stop!" "I'm simply making conversation," she protested innocently. "After all, we know so little about Sarah's background." "Where did you grow up, dear? What are your aspirations beyond coffee preparation?" "I grew up in a small town in Washington state," I replied. "As for aspirations, I'm interested in sustainable technology and renewable energy." Bradley perked up at this. "Really? My firm's been trying to get in on the ground floor with Chen Technologies. They're revolutionizing the energy storage sector. You probably haven't heard of them, but..." I bit back a smile. Chen Technologies, my company, named after my grandmother who raised me while my parents worked. "I've read a bit about them," I said mildly. "Sarah doesn't need to concern herself with such matters," Margaret interrupted. "I'm sure the intricacies of high-level business are quite beyond..." She broke off as her gesturing hand accidentally knocked over a full glass of red wine, sending it cascading across my dress. "Oh dear," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "What a shame. Martha, please bring some club soda. Though I'm afraid that dress is probably ruined. Such delicate fabric." I stayed perfectly calm, even as the expensive Bordeaux soaked through to my skin. "No worries, Mrs. Winchester. Accidents happen." James was on his feet, napkin in hand, looking mortified. "Mother, that was completely..." "It's fine, James." I touched his arm. "Really?" "Yes, James." Margaret smiled thinly. "Sarah's used to dealing with spills, aren't you, dear? Perhaps you could give Martha some tips on stain removal, from your professional experience." The dig was so blatant that even Aunt Cordelia picked up on it, peering at Margaret through her thick glasses. "Really, Margaret," she huffed. As Martha helped me clean up, I noticed James watching his mother with growing disillusionment. Good. He needed to see her true colors before everything came out. The rest of dinner was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Margaret accidentally mentioned 3 more eligible society women, made countless comments about the importance of proper breeding, and even suggested that perhaps I could cater their next family event. "Since you're so experienced in food service, dear." By dessert, James was seething, his knuckles white around his fork. But I maintained my composure, remembering all the boardroom battles I'd won by staying cool under pressure. As we left, Margaret caught my arm. "I hope this evening has helped you understand where James comes from, dear. Our world, it's not for everyone." I smiled, thinking of the prenup meeting scheduled for next week. "You know, Mrs. Winchester, I couldn't agree more. Your world isn't for everyone. But maybe, just maybe, it's not the only world that matters." She blinked, caught off guard by my calm defiance. In the car, James apologized profusely. I knew she could be elitist, but this was beyond anything. I took his hand. Sometimes people show you exactly who they are. The trick is paying attention. The prenup meeting is next week, he said quietly. I don't want you to feel pressured. Trust me. I squeezed his hand. That meeting is going to be very interesting. Wedding planning with Margaret Winchester was exactly what I expected. A masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation wrapped in a designer package. She swooped into the coffee shop early one morning, armed with a Hermes notebook and a determination to take control of everything. I've taken the liberty of booking the Fairmont Olympic Hotel for the reception, she announced without preamble. It's where all the Winchester weddings have been held. Tradition is so important, don't you think? I wiped my hands on my apron, hiding my amusement. I actually owned a significant stake in the Fairmont Hotel chain through one of my investment portfolios. That's very generous, Mrs. Winchester, but James and I were thinking of something smaller, more intimate. Her perfectly penciled eyebrows arched. Smaller? More intimate? She said it like I'd suggested having the wedding in a truck stop. Darling, this is a Winchester wedding. We have obligations, appearances to maintain. The governor will be attending, not to mention at least 3 state senators. The governor? I repeated, thinking of how I'd declined his dinner invitation just last week. I wasn't aware James was so politically connected. The Winchester family has deep roots in this community, she preened, which is why everything must be perfect. The way she looked at me made it clear she considered me the one imperfect element in her grand plan. She pulled out a stack of glossy magazines. Now I've selected several suitable designers for your dress. Nothing too elaborate, of course. We must work within your means. Perhaps we could start a little fund to help you manage the expenses. I know James would never say anything, but he's used to a certain standard. That's very thoughtful, I replied, thinking of the vintage Dior collection hanging in my other apartment. But I actually have some ideas about the dress. Oh? Her smile was pure condescension. And where exactly were you planning to acquire this dress? David's bridal, perhaps? Before I could respond, she continued, I've also taken the liberty of hiring Martina Chen as our wedding planner. She's absolutely brilliant, practically royalty in the event planning world. Usually has a 3-year waiting list. But she owes me a favor. I nearly choked on my own tongue. Martina Chen, my mother, who had indeed become an elite event planner after retiring from nursing, though mostly just for fun. She'd been struggling not to tell Margaret the truth during their initial consultation. The guest list is already at 400, Margaret continued, flipping through her notebook. Though we might need to seat your family at the back tables, just to maintain a certain aesthetic balance. 400? I raised an eyebrow. That seems excessive. Nonsense. The Astors alone are bringing 30 people, and the Van Burens, and the Rothschilds. She paused, eyeing my coffee-stained apron. I assume your guest list will be more modest? If she only knew that I'd had dinner with the Rothschilds last month to discuss a clean energy initiative. I have a few people in mind, I said mildly. Yes, well, she sniffed. Perhaps your little coffee shop friends could help with the service instead of attending as guests. It would save on costs, and they'd probably be more comfortable in that role anyway. I counted to 10 silently. Mrs. Winchester, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, this is James and my wedding. We should have some say in the planning. Oh, darling, she laughed, that brittle society laugh that never reached her eyes. You can't possibly understand the complexities involved, the social obligations, the family expectations. This isn't just a wedding, it's a Winchester event. She pulled out a checkbook. Now, about the budget. I'm prepared to be quite generous despite my reservations about this whole situation. Let's say $50,000 for your dress, though you'll need quite a bit of alterations to look appropriate. That won't be necessary, I said firmly. Don't be proud, dear. We both know you can't afford the kind of wedding James deserves. Think of it as an investment in your transformation. Just then, my phone buzzed. A notification that my company's stock had jumped another 10 points. The irony was almost too much. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but James and I would prefer to handle the wedding our way. Her eyes narrowed. You do realize that without our support, you'll be having your reception in this charming little establishment? Perhaps serving those delightful burnt pastries you're so proud of? Maybe that wouldn't be so bad, I suggested. Something authentic, meaningful. Authentic? She practically spat the word. My dear, you have no idea what you're getting into. The Winchester name means something in this city. We have standards to maintain, appearances to keep up. You can't possibly expect James to settle for some shabby little coffee shop wedding just because you can't afford better. I thought about the prenup meeting scheduled for tomorrow, about how this whole charade was about to end. You know, Mrs. Winchester, sometimes things aren't exactly what they appear to be. What's that supposed to mean? Just that tomorrow might be enlightening. She gathered her things, clearly frustrated by her inability to steamroll me. Well, when you come to your senses about accepting our help, do let me know. Though I must say, this stubborn pride of yours isn't very attractive. James needs a wife who understands her place in society. As she clicked her way out of my coffee shop, I smiled to myself. Tomorrow's prenup meeting was going to be quite the education for Margaret Winchester, in understanding exactly what place in society really meant. The law offices of Harrison, Smith & Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise. My building, actually, though the Winchester family didn't know that yet. I'd chosen to wear my barista clothes one last time. Simple jeans, a sweater from Target, and my comfortable work shoes. The receptionist gave me a dismissive glance as I walked in, which made me smile. I'd been in this same office 2 weeks ago negotiating a major acquisition, but today I was playing a different role. Margaret Winchester was already there, perched on a leather chair like a queen on her throne. She'd brought reinforcements, not just their family lawyer, but also James's father, Richard Winchester, who I'd yet to meet. James sat uncomfortably between them, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Sarah? Margaret's smile was razor sharp. How practical you look today. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened. A familiar face appeared. Jessica Zhang, my personal attorney and trusted friend for the past decade. She'd been dying to witness this moment. Ms. Chen's legal team has arrived, Jessica announced professionally. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. Legal team? I thought we were just having a simple prenup meeting. Surely you don't need... She trailed off as 5 more people entered the room, each carrying leather briefcases and tablets. This is irregular, Margaret's lawyer protested. We prepared a standard prenuptial agreement protecting the Winchester family assets. It's quite straightforward, really. Jessica smiled. Oh, we have our own draft to present. But first, there are some disclosures that need to be made. Disclosures? James looked confused. Sarah, what's going on? I took a deep breath. James, there's something I need to tell you. Everyone, actually. I reached for my phone and pulled up an email. Jessica, would you mind sharing the documents? My team distributed tablets to everyone in the room. Margaret picked hers up like it might bite her. What is this? Richard Winchester spoke for the first time, scanning the screen. That, Jessica explained, is a comprehensive list of Ms. Chen's assets, holdings, and net worth as of this morning. The room went silent. I watched as the color drained from Margaret's face. Richard's eyes widened as he scrolled through the pages. James just stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. This This must be a mistake, Margaret sputtered. These numbers are accurate, Jessica confirmed. Sarah Chen is the founder and CEO of Chen Technologies. She also holds controlling interests in 17 other companies, including the building we're sitting in right now. Margaret's lawyer adjusted his glasses nervously. Chen Technologies? The energy storage company? The same, Jessica nodded, currently valued at just over $40 billion. But she's a barista. Margaret's voice had risen an octave. I work as a barista, I corrected gently. By choice. The coffee shop is one of my smaller investments. A place where I could meet people who didn't know about my wealth, who would see me for who I am, not what I own. James hadn't said a word yet. His eyes moved from the tablet to me and back again. This is preposterous, Margaret declared, but her voice shook slightly. If this were true, why would you pretend to be a simple coffee shop worker? I finished for her. Because money changes people, Mrs. Winchester. It changes how they treat you, how they see you. I wanted to know that anyone who came into my life valued me for myself, not my bank account. I don't understand. James finally spoke. All this time. I'm still the same person, I said softly. The one who makes your coffee exactly how you like it, who volunteers at the animal shelter, who loves sci-fi movies and falls asleep during historical documentaries. I just happen to also run a global technology company. Richard Winchester was still scrolling through the documents, his expression shifting from shock to something like respect. Chen Technologies. I tried to get a meeting with your CEO last year. They said she was too busy. I was making lattes, I admitted. It was during the morning rush. Margaret looked like she might faint. But all those times I offered to help with expenses, the wedding budget. About that, Jessica interjected smoothly. Ms. Chen has prepared her own prenuptial agreement. One that not only protects her assets, but also ensures Mr. Winchester's continued independence in his environmental law practice. She's quite supportive of his work. James set down his tablet. The animal shelter. You didn't just volunteer there. I funded their new wing, I admitted. The one your mother said was a waste of money at that dinner party. The coffee shop? Is profitable, actually. But yes, I own it. Along with the entire block. Margaret was still shaking her head. This is impossible. You let me treat you like someone beneath you. I finished quietly. Yes, I did. Because it showed me exactly who you are, Mrs. Winchester. Money doesn't make people cruel or kind. It just makes them more of what they already are. The room fell silent again. James was still looking at me, his expression now shifting between amazement and something else. Understanding, perhaps. So, Jessica said brightly, shall we discuss the terms of the prenuptial agreement? Ms. Chen has some interesting proposals regarding charitable foundations and environmental initiatives. As my team began their presentation, I watched the Winchester family trying to process this new reality. Richard looked thoroughly impressed, Margaret appeared to be having an existential crisis, and James reached under the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. Maybe, just maybe, this was going to work out after all. The aftermath of the prenup meeting was exactly what you'd expect when you drop a billion-dollar bomb into the middle of a family drama. As we left the law office, Margaret was still in shock, her perfectly manicured hand clutching her designer bag like a life preserver. James hadn't let go of my hand since the revelation, though I wasn't sure if it was for support or to make sure I didn't disappear with the rest of his newly adjusted reality. We should talk, he said quietly as we reached my car. Not the modest Prius I usually drove to the coffee shop, but the Tesla I'd had my driver bring around. Another small truth finally seeing daylight. Yes, we should. I turned to his parents. Would you like to join us? I have a feeling there are questions you'd like to ask. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. That is, we... I think that's a splendid idea, Richard interjected, looking more amused than anything else. Perhaps somewhere private? My penthouse is just upstairs, I offered. Margaret's eyes widened further at the realization that I owned not just the building's office space, but also lived in its most exclusive residence. The elevator ride was silent. I used my private key to access the top floor, and as the doors opened directly into my home, I heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. The space was modern but warm, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Original artwork hung on the walls, pieces I'd collected from emerging artists I believed in, not just names that would impress. Please sit. I gestured to the living room. Would anyone like something to drink? I make a pretty good latte. That broke the tension slightly. James actually laughed, though it had a slightly hysterical edge to it. I think we need something stronger, Richard suggested. I poured drinks, a fine scotch I knew Richard would appreciate, white wine for Margaret, who looked like she needed it, and James's favorite craft beer that I'd always kept stocked but claimed a regular customer had left behind. So, I said, sitting beside James, where would you like to start? Why? It was Margaret who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you pretend to be poor? I finished for her. I didn't pretend to be anything, Mrs. Winchester. I simply didn't advertise my wealth. Everything else, who I am, what I believe in, how I treat people, that was all real. But the coffee shop, working as a barista, is something I genuinely enjoy. It keeps me grounded, connected to real people. Do you know how hard it is to make genuine connections when people know you're worth billions? Everyone either wants something from you or is intimidated by you. I think I understand, James said slowly. All those times you talked about wanting to start your own business someday. I was speaking from experience, I smiled. Just not about future plans. The animal shelter renovation, Margaret cut in, seeming to find her voice. The new wing, when I said it was a waste of money. You were criticizing my own donation, yes. I took a sip of my drink. Just like you were insulting my mother's event planning skills when you hired her for the wedding. Margaret choked on her wine. Martina Chen is your mother? The very same. She took up event planning after retiring from nursing. She's been having quite a time keeping this secret, by the way. Richard leaned forward, looking thoughtful. The night of the dinner party, when Bradley was talking about trying to get a meeting with Chen Technologies. I was sitting right there, yes. I couldn't help but grin. He's been trying to get a meeting with me for months. I'm still not interested in his investment proposal, by the way. All those times I offered to help with expenses, Margaret said faintly, made comments about your clothes, your job, your everything, were very enlightening, I finished. They showed me exactly what kind of person you are when you think you have the upper hand. James squeezed my hand. I'm so sorry about all of that. Don't be. You never treated me differently whether you thought I was a barista or not. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But why maintain the charade for so long? Richard asked. Surely after you and James became serious? I needed to be sure, I said simply. In my position, it's hard to know who to trust. I've had relationships end the moment people found out about my wealth. Others that began purely because of it. With James, I wanted to know it was real. And now? James asked quietly. Is it still real? I turned to face him fully. That depends. Do you feel differently about me now that you know the truth? He was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Well, I am a little relieved I won't have to feel guilty about taking you to expensive restaurants anymore. James! Margaret exclaimed, but I was laughing. I still expect you to order that simple Americano every morning, I told him. No fancy drinks just because you know I own the place. Dear God, Margaret muttered. My son's fiancé has been making his coffee every morning. The press will have a field day with this. Actually, I corrected, your son's fiancé has been making excellent coffee every morning because she enjoys it. The press doesn't factor into it. Richard raised his glass. To unexpected revelations and excellent coffee. As we clinked glasses, I caught Margaret staring at me with an unreadable expression. The woman who had spent months looking down her nose at me was now seeing me in a completely different light. But the question remained. Was she seeing me? Or just my bank account? The answer, I suspected, would determine a lot about our future family dynamics. It's amazing how quickly people can change their tune when they realize they've been looking down on someone who could buy and sell their entire family fortune with their pocket change. The week after the prenup revelation, Margaret Winchester launched what I can only describe as an aggressive campaign of redemption. It started with the gifts. Every morning, like clockwork, elaborate packages would arrive at the coffee shop. Monday brought a Hermes scarf identical to the one she always wore, all $3,000 of hand-rolled silk. Tuesday, it was a Cartier bracelet. Wednesday, a Chanel handbag. Each delivery came with increasingly desperate notes. To my dear future daughter-in-law, who has such impeccable taste. For the brilliant businesswoman I always knew you would be. To the lovely Sarah, whose potential I spotted immediately. I donated each gift to a women's shelter, sending Margaret the tax receipts. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Absolutely. But the gifts were just the beginning. She started showing up at the coffee shop every day, ordering complicated drinks she didn't want, just to tell everyone within earshot how proud she was of her future daughter-in-law. Sarah is just so impressive, she'd gushed to bewildered customers. Running this charming little coffee shop while also being a secret billionaire. Such admirable work ethic. I always said there was something special about her, didn't I, James? James, who'd stopped by for his usual morning coffee, nearly choked on his Americano. Mother, I'm pretty sure you said she was beneath our social class and would embarrass the family at country club events. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Oh, darling, I was just testing her character, making sure she was strong enough to handle our world. And look how magnificently she proved herself. The regular customers exchanged confused looks. Most of them still didn't know about my real identity. I'd asked James and his family to keep it quiet for now. So, to them, Margaret's sudden transformation from coffee-spilling snob to overwhelming cheerleader was both baffling and entertaining. I've been thinking about the wedding, she announced one morning, spreading bridal magazines across the counter while I tried to serve actual customers. Now that we know about your resources, we simply must upgrade everything. The Fairmont is lovely, of course, but what about that private island you own in the Pacific? So much more exclusive. Mrs. Winchester, I said patiently, I don't own a private island. Oh. She looked momentarily deflated, then brightened. Well, you could buy one. I know this lovely little atoll that's on the market. The Fairmont is fine, I interrupted, though James and I are still considering that small ceremony we talked about. Her face fell. But surely now that everyone knows who you are. That's exactly why I want to keep it intimate, I explained, pulling espresso shots for a waiting customer. My life has enough spectacle in it already. She wasn't listening. I've already called Vogue about a feature. They're very interested in the billionaire barista angle. And the governor is simply dying to give a toast. He's been trying to get a meeting with you for months, apparently. Margaret. I used her first name deliberately, watching her snap to attention. The wedding will be what James and I want it to be. Not what you think it should be, not what society expects, and definitely not what Vogue wants to feature. She clutched her designer bag tighter. I'm just trying to help, to make up for treating me like I was worthless because you thought I was poor. She had the grace to blush. I never thought you were worthless exactly. Just not quite up to our standards. And now that you know I'm richer than your entire social circle combined, now I understand why you were so confident. She finished lamely. So unwilling to accept my help or guidance. I set down the portafilter I was cleaning. No, Mrs. Winchester, you don't understand at all. My confidence had nothing to do with my bank account. It came from knowing who I am and being comfortable with that person, whether she's making coffee or running a company. But surely you must see that we're on the same level now, she pressed. We can finally have a real relationship, mother and daughter. The only thing that's changed is your perception, I pointed out. I'm exactly the same person I was before. The question is, are you? She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I've been calling all my friends, telling them how wrong I was about you. Everyone's simply amazed by the story. The Astors want to host a dinner in your honor. The Vanderbilts are hoping you'll join their charity board. The Rothschilds already had dinner with me last month. I finished. We discussed clean energy initiatives. They didn't know I was also a barista, and I didn't know they were friends with my future mother-in-law. Funny how that works out. She looked stricken. You already know them? Mrs. Winchester, I know most of your social circle. I just know them in boardrooms, not at charity galas. And none of them knew about my coffee shop job because, unlike some people, they don't judge someone's worth by their occupation. That one hit home. She sank onto a nearby stool, looking deflated. I've really made a mess of things, haven't I? Yes, I agreed. You have. But you know what? You have a chance to fix it. Not with expensive gifts or social connections or damage control, but by actually seeing people, really seeing them for who they are, not what they own or what they do for a living. She was quiet for a long moment, watching me serve customers, joke with my staff, and wipe down counters. All the things she'd previously seen as beneath her family's dignity. Could you teach me how to make a latte? She asked finally, her voice small. I smiled. Maybe there was hope for her after all. Let's start with something simpler. How about learning to drink one first? The morning of my wedding, I did something that shocked everyone. I opened the coffee shop. There I was, at 6 a.m. in my barista apron over silk pajamas, making lattes for my regular customers. My wedding planner, aka my mother, nearly had a heart attack when she found me there. Sarah Chen, you are getting married in 6 hours. And my customers need their coffee now, I replied, finishing a perfect heart in the foam of a regular's cappuccino. Besides, it's calming. The truth was, I needed this moment of normalcy before the chaos that would be my wedding day. Despite my best efforts to keep things simple, certain compromises had been made. Yes, we were having it at the Fairmont, but in the smallest ballroom, not the grand one Margaret had originally booked. Yes, there were some high-profile guests, but we'd limited the list to people who actually knew us, not Margaret's entire social registry. My dress was simple but elegant, a classic design from a local seamstress, not the designer gown Margaret had tried to force on me. The look on her face when I'd told her I wasn't wearing the $100,000 Vera Wang she'd surprised me with was almost worth the 3-hour lecture that followed. "But everyone will be expecting something grander," she'd protested. "Everyone can focus on our marriage instead of my dress," I'd replied. Now, as I stood in the bridal suite getting ready, I could hear Margaret in the hallway, micromanaging every detail she could still control. She'd been on her best behavior lately, trying to prove she'd changed. But old habits die hard. "The place cards must be arranged by social rank," I heard her insisting to someone. "The governor can't possibly be seated next to a barista." "The governor's daughter is a barista," I called out through the door. "And she's sitting at the same table as her father." Silence, then, "Oh, well, that's different." James and I had decided to break with tradition and get ready together. He sat in the corner of the suite, all ready in his tux, watching me with amusement as I did my own makeup. "You know we have professional stylists waiting outside," he pointed out. "I can run a multinational corporation and make a perfect latte. I think I can handle mascara." He laughed, then grew serious. "You know my mother's planning to make a speech at the reception. She's been working on it all week." I know. I'd seen drafts of it. Margaret had emailed me 15 versions, each more dramatically revisionist than the last. The latest one included a claim that she'd always seen the CEO potential in me. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. We'd written our own vows, making promises about coffee runs and late-night conversations, about supporting each other's dreams and fighting for what's right. I caught Margaret tearing up in the front row, though whether from emotion or from the fact that I'd refused to let her release doves at the crucial moment was anyone's guess. Then came the reception, and with it, Margaret's moment. She clinked her glass, rising to her feet with the determined air of someone about to rewrite history. "When I first met Sarah," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "I knew there was something special about her." James squeezed my hand under the table. We both knew what was coming. Margaret's carefully crafted narrative about how she'd spotted my potential from the start, how she'd always believed in me. "She was just a barista then," Margaret continued, "or so we thought. But I saw beyond that humble exterior to the—" "Mom," James interrupted, standing up. "Don't." Margaret blinked. "Don't what, darling?" "Don't pretend you saw anything beyond your own prejudices. Don't try to rewrite history to make yourself look better. Sarah deserves better than that. We all do." The room went silent. Margaret's perfectly maintained facade cracked slightly. "I'm just trying to pretend you didn't spend months treating my wife like she was beneath you?" James's voice was gentle but firm. "To act like you didn't try to break us up because you thought she wasn't good enough for our family?" Margaret looked lost, her carefully prepared speech crumpling in her manicured hands. I stood up then, placing a hand on James's arm. "Actually, I'd like to say something." All eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath. "Mrs. Winchester, you're right. When we first met, I was just a barista. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem wasn't my job. It was your assumption that someone's occupation determines their worth. But people are more than their bank accounts or their job titles. They're more than their social connections or their family names." I raised my glass. "So I'd like to make an announcement. In honor of my new mother-in-law, I'm establishing the Winchester Foundation for Educational Equity. It's a $10 million initiative to provide scholarships and support for service industry workers pursuing higher education. And yes, that includes baristas." Margaret's face went through a fascinating array of emotions: shock, embarrassment, and finally, something that looked almost like understanding. That is..." She stumbled, then straightened her shoulders. "Thank you, Sarah. You're absolutely right. I was..." Wrong? I suggested gently. She nodded, and for the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Winchester's smile was entirely genuine. Wrong. And I'm sorry. James wrapped his arm around my waist. See? Sometimes people can surprise you. They can, I agreed, thinking of how far we'd all come. Just like a barista can turn out to be a CEO. Or a CEO can turn out to be a pretty great barista, he added, kissing my cheek. As the reception continued around us, I caught Margaret watching us with a thoughtful expression. Maybe she was finally understanding that true worth isn't measured in dollars or social status. Or maybe she was just calculating how to spin this story at her next country club lunch. Either way, I made a mental note to teach her how to make a proper latte. After all, we were family now. Married life brought its own set of challenges, especially when you're balancing being a CEO, a barista, and a newlywed. With a mother-in-law who's trying desperately to prove she's changed. The first test came when James and I moved into our new home, a modern, eco-friendly house I'd had built on the outskirts of the city. Margaret showed up unannounced the day after we returned from our honeymoon, armed with an interior decorator and a mission. Darling! She burst through the door before I could finish my morning coffee. I know you're busy with your various enterprises, so I took the liberty of hiring Claude. He's done all the Astor homes, and he has the most wonderful vision for this space. Claude, a man who looked like he'd never encountered a color he couldn't make beige, sniffed disapprovingly at our decor. The current aesthetic is rather eclectic. That was a polite way of describing our home, which blended my tech-forward sensibilities with James's environmental consciousness and our shared love of quirky art. The living room featured a smart glass wall that doubled as a massive display, while recycled materials and sustainable furniture filled the space. Local artists' works hung next to vintage science fiction movie posters. Mrs. Winchester, I said carefully, while I appreciate the thought, James and I are happy with our home as it is. But surely now that you're married, you'll want something more sophisticated. She gestured vaguely at the coffee shop sign I'd hung in our kitchen, the first one from my original shop. Something more befitting your status? Our status is exactly what we choose it to be, James said, coming downstairs. And we choose to live in a home that reflects who we are, not what others expect us to be. Margaret's face fell slightly. I just thought, well, now that everyone knows about Sarah's position... Nothing has changed, I interrupted gently. I'm still the same person who makes coffee every morning. The only difference is that now I do it in my own kitchen before heading to the office. But the social obligations, the expectations, people will want to visit, to see how you live. Then they'll see a home that's authentic to us, James said firmly. Not a showcase designed by someone else. Claude looked personally offended by our reject of his services, but Margaret's reaction surprised me. Instead of pushing back, she actually seemed to consider our words. I suppose. It is rather cozy in here, she admitted, looking around with new eyes. Though I still think the coffee sign in the kitchen is a bit casual. That sign represents where we met, where we fell in love, James pointed out. It's staying. This became the pattern of our new normal. Margaret trying to insert herself into our lives in increasingly creative ways, and us establishing gentle but firm boundaries. When she tried to reorganize my schedule to accommodate more society lunches, I appreciate the invitations, but my mornings belong to the coffee shop, and my afternoons to the company. When she attempted to hire a personal chef, we enjoy cooking together, Mrs. Winchester. It's our time to decompress and connect. When she suggested we needed a larger house for entertaining, this home is exactly what we want. Sustainable, comfortable, and ours. The turning point came about a month after the wedding. Margaret arrived for her now regular morning visit to find me behind the coffee counter at home, teaching James how to make a proper latte. "But you have staff for that," she protested weakly. "Sometimes the joy is in doing things yourself," I explained, guiding James's hands as he tried to create a heart in the foam. "In creating something with your own efforts." She watched us for a moment. James concentrated on his wobbly foam art, me in my CEO clothes but wearing my old barista apron, both of us laughing at his attempts. "You really do love this, don't you?" she asked quietly. "The coffee shop, I mean. It wasn't just a social experiment." "I love all parts of my life," I told her. "The company challenges my mind, but the coffee shop feeds my soul. Being a CEO gives me the power to make big changes in the world, but being a barista keeps me connected to the people those changes affect." James presented his mother with his latest attempt at a latte. The foam heart looked more like a blob, but his proud smile was infectious. "Would you like to learn?" I offered, holding out a spare apron. Margaret looked at it like it might bite her. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." "Why not? You're family now. And family shares their passions." Slowly, hesitantly, she took the apron. I suppose I could try, but only because you're both so enthusiastic about it." And that's how Margaret Winchester, queen of the country club set, ended up learning how to make coffee art in my kitchen. She was terrible at it, but for the first time since I'd known her, she wasn't trying to be perfect. She was just trying to be present. "I think I'm beginning to understand," she said later, covered in coffee grounds but smiling. "Why you kept the coffee shop, even after everything." "Oh?" "It's not about the money or the status. It's about doing what makes you happy, what feels authentic." James and I exchanged surprised looks. Maybe the new normal wasn't just about setting boundaries. Maybe it was about building bridges, too. "Although," she added, examining her coffee-stained designer blouse, "I still think we could benefit from a personal chef. Just for special occasions." Some things never change completely, and maybe that's okay, too. 6 months into our marriage, I invited the entire Winchester family over for dinner. James knew what I was planning to announce, but Margaret and Richard had no idea they were about to witness yet another transformation in their understanding of wealth and success. I'd prepared the meal myself, something that still baffled Margaret, who couldn't understand why a billionaire would choose to cook. But as we sat around our dining table, enjoying pasta made from scratch, I could see her beginning to appreciate these simple pleasures. "I have something to announce," I said as we finished the main course. "I've made a decision about the future of Chen Technologies." Margaret perked up immediately. She'd been dropping hints about James joining the company board, despite his repeated insistence that he was happy with his environmental law practice. "I'm donating 70% of my fortune to establish a global clean energy initiative," I announced. "The remaining 30% will be split between sustainable technology research and expanding educational opportunities for underprivileged communities." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. But that's billions of dollars," she stammered. "Your entire fortune." "Not my entire fortune," I corrected. "I'm keeping enough to live comfortably and to seed new ventures. But the bulk of it will do more good in the world than it would sitting in my bank account." "But what about future generations?" Margaret protested. "Your children's inheritance?" James took my hand, smiling. "Our children will inherit something more valuable than money, Mom. They'll inherit our values, our work ethic, and our commitment to making the world better." "Besides," I added, "James and I have plans to build something new together." This was the part I was most excited about. James and I had spent months developing the idea, merging his environmental passion with my business experience. "We're launching a new company," James explained. "A legal tech startup focused on helping environmental organizations fight corporate polluters. Sarah's business expertise combined with my legal background, we think we can make a real difference." "But you'll be starting over," Margaret said, looking faint. "After everything you've built." "That's the point," I said softly. "True wealth isn't about maintaining what you have. It's about having the courage to risk it all for something you believe in." Richard, who had been quietly listening, suddenly laughed. "You know, when James first told us he was dating a barista, I worried he was throwing away his potential. Now I realize he was actually reaching for it." Margaret wasn't so easily convinced. "But your position in society, your influence, will now come from what we do, not what we own," I finished. "The coffee shop taught me something valuable, Mrs. Winchester. People respect authenticity more than wealth. They connect with passion more than power." "The coffee shop," she repeated weakly. "Are you keeping that, at least?" "Of course. In fact, we're expanding it into a chain of community-focused cafes. Each one will offer job training programs and educational support for its employees. The Winchester Foundation will help fund it." "You're really doing this," Margaret said, more a statement than a question. "Walking away from billions." "Walking toward something better," James corrected. "Something we can build together." I watched my mother-in-law process this information, seeing the final pieces of her worldview rearrange themselves. The woman who had once dismissed me as a simple barista was now struggling to understand why anyone would voluntarily give up the wealth she'd always seen as the ultimate goal. "I think I need something stronger than wine," she finally said. "How about a latte?" I offered with a smile. "I hear you've been practicing." To everyone's surprise, Margaret got up and headed to our kitchen's coffee station. Her hands shook slightly as she worked the espresso machine, but she managed to produce 4 decent lattes, complete with wobbly foam hearts. "Not quite up to your standards," she said, placing one in front of me. "But I'm learning that perfection isn't always the point." "No," I agreed, taking a sip. "Sometimes the joy is in the journey, not the destination." "Though the destination can be pretty sweet too," James added, pulling me close. As we sat there, the CEO turned barista, the environmental lawyer, and his formerly status-obsessed parents, sharing slightly imperfect lattes and plans for a future built on purpose rather than profit, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd all come. Margaret took another sip of her latte, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, if you're going to revolutionize the coffee shop industry, you'll need someone to handle the social connections. I do know every influential person in the city." "Are you offering to help?" I asked, amused. "I'm offering to be part of something meaningful," she corrected. "If you'll have me." James squeezed my hand under the table. We'd come full circle, from a mother-in-law who thought I wasn't good enough for her son because I was just a barista, to one who was willing to roll up her designer sleeves and join our cause. "Welcome to the family business," I said, raising my cup. "All of it." As we clinked our coffee cups together, I thought about all the twists and turns that had led us here. From hiding my wealth to find authentic love, to giving it away to create authentic change. Sometimes the richest moments in life have nothing to do with money at all. They're found in a perfect cup of coffee, a shared dream, and the understanding that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind.